Okay, it is September 12th, 2023, and today I'm going to be talking about the endocrine system and supporting the endocrine system with plant medicine. So the endocrine system is kind of not really a system in quite the same way that circulatory system or the digestive system is, because those are a set of structures that are all connected to each other. The whole digestive system is, one long set of organs that are interconnected that run the length of your body. Circulatory system is all connected, goes throughout your body. The endocrine system is not structurally connected. They are functionally connected, and they've been grouped together by people. But they're a set of organs and a set of functions of those organs that control metabolism, including cell growth and the development of the body, and including how the body handles nutrition as far as turning it into energy, using it as energy, or storing it as fat and muscle and so forth. And also reproduction, and it has some effect on mood, the thought processes and so forth. So it is one of the two main systems of signaling in the body. The nervous system is one, and the endocrine system is another. The nervous system sends messages throughout the body basically instantaneously, very quickly, and the endocrine system sends slower messages throughout the body. But it also enacts changes on a cellular level that the nervous system really cannot do. The nervous system is mostly functioning more on the level of tissues. So for instance, it can make a muscle contract. The endocrine system is functioning on a cellular level, so it can make a muscle grow or atrophy. So it's kind of, in a way, slower and deeper than the nervous system, but both of them are signaling systems, messaging systems throughout the body, ways that messages are sent from one part of the body to another. And whereas the nervous system does this with electrical impulses, the endocrine system does this with chemicals, substances that it produces and releases into the body. And we call these substances hormones. So actually, what makes a substance a hormone is not so much to do with what the substance is made out of or how it's constructed, but just the fact that it is a chemical messenger in the body. It's a signaling molecule that is produced in one area of the body and acts in another area of the body. And a lot of the time when we're talking about the endocrine system and hormones, we are thinking about the glands, endocrine glands, which is a gland that does not excrete stuff to the outside of the body. It's something that a gland that, rather than having a duct that leads things to the outside of the body, releases stuff that goes into the tissues, into the bloodstream, and so forth. So those substances are by definition hormones, but most of them are proteins. Most of them are enzymes or small chains of amino acids that are acting as signaling molecules in the body. And some of them are smaller molecules called steroids, which are sort of maybe some of the ones that are more well known, things like testosterone and estrogen, which I feel like, the names of which are pretty much household names. People might not really have a clear understanding of what these substances do, but they've at least heard of them. Whereas, something like prolactin, maybe people don't know what that is. That's not really so well known, not one that people think a lot about. So the steroidal hormones were something that people sort of isolated earlier and have been part of the cultural consciousness longer, I suppose. But most hormones are not steroids. Most hormones are peptides, amino acid chains, or you could think of them as proteins as well. And these are produced in the glands of the body, but not only there. Some of them are produced in other tissues of the body as well. So it's actually more complicated than people often conceive of it as being or think of it as being. And really, the endocrine system is a very tangled web. It's very complex. If you take the second year of this course, we'll get into further depth about it. Today, we're just going to kind of get a general overview, kind of get the shape of the whole thing of the endocrine system and what it does and how we interact with it using medicinal plants, how we support the endocrine system, and when we need to support the endocrine system in people we might be trying to help. So we'll get into some detail, but not. But there's more and more detail that you can get into, and it's an incredibly complex field of study. So the simplest way that I have ever heard of the endocrine system conceived of is the way that it's thought of in traditional Chinese medicine, or a sort of adjacent concept in traditional Chinese medicine, which is called the conception vessel. And the conception vessel is an imaginary line on the body that runs from, from the head, the front of the head, down the front of the midline of the body, down to the genitals. And so that's that line crosses not only the organs of regeneration, which is why it's called the conception vessel meridian, but also a lot of the other central sites of the endocrine system, including the pancreas, including the thymus, the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland. So it's all along that midline of the body. Not everything is. The adrenal glands, for instance, are kind of off to either side of it. But a lot of those glands are along that line, and that line also is sort of a connection between the brain, which is the center of the nervous system, and the genitals, which are, the center kind of, or, the opposite end of the body, but also part of an adjoining signaling system. So it's sort of like a mirror image of the nervous system, or the spinal cord, is how it's conceived of. So that's one way of thinking of it. A very simple way of thinking of it is like an imaginary line of energy that runs down the front of your body that helps to control reproduction and energy, stamina, things like that in the body. Has some roles in digestion, metabolism, weight loss, and weight gain, and so forth. To look at it in a little more complexity, you can think about it being a series of glands, or like a collection of glands that are located throughout the body. So you have what are technically referred to as the gonads, which is either ovaries or testes, depending on the setup of the particular individual. And then you have, and so those produce, actually, in whichever set the person has, they produce a lot of the same substances, just in different proportions. And those substances would include estrogen and testosterone, both of which, are responsible for development of secondary sex characteristics, both of which are have different effects on mood, state of mind, things like that. They're things that affect how people behave and how they feel. So that's, you know, part of it. And then there's the adrenal glands, which are another really important part of the endocrine system. The substance that most people associate with the adrenal glands is adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. Epinephrine is because an old name for the adrenal gland is the epinephron. Nephron means kidney, epi means kind of about or on. Yeah, on. So it's on the kidney. And if you ever get a chance to see what an adrenaline looks like, an adrenal gland looks like, it doesn't actually look like much. It looks like a small conical glob of fatty tissue on top of the kidney. And you would not look at this organ and think, here's something really important. It doesn't look nearly as consequential as it actually is. And it's a very small organ, two very small organs, really. But they make an immense difference in how the body functions. So adrenaline is produced in an area of the gland called the adrenal medulla, which is kind of the inner layer of the gland, the core of the gland. And when adrenaline is released, it makes the heart beat faster. It makes the body burn up glucose faster. It increases alertness, doesn't exactly increase physical strength. It increases the ability to use physical strength without having a pain response. So, you know, you can lift something that would normally hurt you to lift, and it will hurt you later. You just won't notice it as much at in the moment. So this is part of the fight or flight response. This is part of an evolutionary thing that helps people fight or flee in the face of danger. So it's produced in large amounts under conditions of extreme stress. And it's produced a little bit all the time, and it keeps people awake, and it plays a role in the circadian rhythms of, you know, when people feel energetic and fully awake and when they feel tired and ready to sleep. So that's what's being part of what's being, not the only substance for sure, but part of what is being produced in the core of the adrenal glands. And then in the outer layer, the adrenal cortex is the Latin word for bark, like the bark of a tree. So this is the outer layer of the gland. And that is where some of the body's natural anti-inflammatory steroids are produced. And these are we called corticosteroids. Cortisone is the most well-known of them, also called cortisol. Usually people call it cortisol when it's being produced within the body, and cortisone when it's being taken as a drug, but they're the same substance, if not otherwise specified. You know, you can have hydrocortisone, or you can have, you know, various different preparations of cortisone used as drugs, but the name cortisone, without any other adornment or specification, refers to the same substance as cortisol. And it's just a different convention of referring to it one way or the other, depending on whether it's produced within the body or whether it's taken from the outside. But this is a steroid hormone, and it reduces inflammation and it decreases immune function. So a lot of the time, the body produces this during periods of stress, not necessarily during periods of extraordinary stress the way that adrenaline is, but during periods of stress, during periods where a person is pushing themselves, staying awake when they don't feel like it, worrying a lot, and also after injuries. So a lot of the time, I think evolutionarily, historically, when really, even in some situations in modern times, but especially more often when people lived rougher lives, a lot of the time, if they were stressed, it was because they were in imminent danger of physical harm. So, somebody was maybe in a war, for instance, or about to get in a fight, or, doing something that was really rough on their body. And in those types of situations, the body would produce extra cortisone to keep inflammation down, and along with inflammation, the immune response, because the two are inextricably tied together, keep inflammation down to let people get the job done, even though it might be doing some more damage to their body, rather than having inflammation set in and immobilize someone. So this is sort of it's almost like an override on the inflammatory process. The inflammatory process is happening to try and get the body to repair damage or to get rid of tissue that it thinks needs to be gotten rid of. And the steroids that the body produces can override that, which can be great. It can make people feel better. It can mask all sorts of symptoms, because almost all symptoms involve some kind of inflammation. But it's it comes at a cost, in that there might be ongoing damage being allowed to happen that would otherwise be stopped. So that's the story on cortisone. A lot of the time people will talk about it as though it's a very negative substance. And really, it's not. Really, if you don't have enough of it, you're in very bad trouble, because a certain amount of it is necessary to feel like you have a normal amount of energy and stamina. But if you don't have much of that, if you don't have enough of it, it's hard to get out of bed. And if you have too much of it, then it's hard to rest. And it's also hard for your body to repair damage that's happening to it. It's hard for your immune system to fight off threats, and so forth. So there can be a downside to being out of balance in either direction. So that's kind of a quick overview of the story of the adrenal glands. Okay, so there's a question of what causes it to be low. A lot of the time, it's low for genetic reasons. If someone does not have the genes to produce the proteins that tell it to work, that's really the main reason that it's low. There's kind of an idea that that has been popular, of people having sort of burned out adrenals, or their adrenals being unable to produce because of being overworked or whatever. But usually, if you actually look at the levels of substances in someone's blood who has those kind of symptoms, it's actually not that they don't have enough cortisol or don't have enough adrenal function. It's actually usually other stuff. So most of the time when it's low, it's genetic. It can also be physical damage. It can also be malnourishment. If somebody, because all of the, well, not all of, the steroids that are produced in the body are generally made from cholesterol. And if you don't have enough fat and enough nutrition in your body, you can actually get less than you need of a lot of your hormones. And that can include cortisol as well. Yeah, when it's just a little bit low, a lot of the time it's a result of something else being off in the endocrine system, like the thyroid, for instance. If the thyroid is low, then the adrenals sometimes will be low along with it, because the thyroid isn't producing as much of the stuff that makes the adrenal glands, well, the stuff that the thyroid produces makes the adrenal glands work harder. So having a different gland elsewhere in the endocrine system be thrown off can also definitely throw off the adrenal glands. The adrenals are also capable of making some estrogen and testosterone and thyroxine. So they can actually make small amounts of supplementary amounts of the substances that are usually made by other endocrine glands. So if somebody doesn't have a thyroid, they might still have some thyroxine in their body because some thyroid hormones in their body because the adrenal glands are able to produce it. Same if they don't have ovaries or if they don't have testes anymore, then the adrenal glands can produce some of what would have been produced in those organs. Question, will CMOS help fix thyroid issues? It kind of depends on what's going on with the thyroid. Most of the time, that's not the problem, but if it's really a matter of there not being enough iodine, it can, and sometimes it helps a little bit with other stuff, with other reasons. Okay, so moving up that midline of the body from where the adrenal glands are. So the adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys, like I mentioned, and you're not sure where the kidneys are. They're basically just forward of the place of the, if you think about on someone's back, you have the spine running down the middle of the back, and at a certain point you have the bottom of the rib cage coming up and making a corner with the spine. So the kidneys are right in there, and the adrenals are right in there too, in that costovertebral angle, which is the corner formed between the lower ribs and the spine. So that's where the kidneys and adrenals are on the body. Some people think they're a lot lower than that or something like that, but they're kind of in the middle of your back. Right around the same level or just a little bit above that, you would have the pancreas. And the pancreas is a really huge player in the endocrine system. It's an organ that a lot of people forget exists until something goes wrong with it. So it has multiple different functions, but one of the things that it does is that it produces insulin. And insulin is a hormone which helps to regulate blood sugar, of course. Insulin lowers the amount of blood sugar in the body, and it's what your body uses to keep that at a level that it can handle. If you don't have enough insulin, then glucose is getting released into your bloodstream, and it's eventually going to have to get processed out by the kidneys, and it's going to be flowing through the blood vessels and causing damage because it's sort of sugar is drying. And so too much blood sugar has a drying, shriveling effect on the tiny blood vessels in the body, which can make people lose their eyesight. It can make them lose feeling in their hands and feet, and it can eventually lead to lack of or loss of kidney function. So that's if there's not enough insulin. If there's too much insulin, then it can actually cause the body to crash pretty hard because you don't have the blood sugar that you need to keep every cell in your body running. So it can be, depending on how much of too much it is, it can lead to hypoglycemia, or it can lead to even things like multiple organ failure and death, which is more something you would see if someone took insulin in a larger amount than they were supposed to, than something that would typically happen just from natural overproduction of it. In addition to that, the pancreas also really plays a role in regulating electrolytes in the body. If the pancreas is damaged, it's very hard for the body to regulate, to maintain proper levels of electrolytes, and that can cause problems with all sorts of things, with breathing especially, and also with kidney function and heart function and so forth. So the pancreas doesn't just do blood sugar; it does multiple different things. But that's something that it's well known for, because it's something that when the pancreas gets damaged and stops being able to produce adequate quantities of insulin, then that, is potentially a very life-threatening or life-shortening situation. In the last century and a little bit more, people have learned to use insulin from external sources to supplement what's not being produced. But that's kind of a big part of the role that the pancreas plays. Now, stepping back for just a moment, I should have mentioned this before. We don't usually talk about the kidneys being part of the endocrine system, because we think of them as being part of the urinary system or something like that. But they do actually play a big role in the endocrine system plays a role in regulating how the kidneys work. And then that sort of feeds back into the fact that how the kidneys work plays a role in how much of those regulatory hormones are being produced. And you find feedback loops like this all throughout the body, where a hormone will act on an organ, and then the organ will have some response to that hormone that then makes it so the body doesn't keep producing the hormone. And with the kidneys, a couple of the hormones that are involved in that are angiotensin and aldosterone. And angiotensin causes blood vessels to tighten up. Aldosterone is a steroid hormone that sort of works along with testosterone and other androgens, and has roles in hair growth and muscle development and all sorts of other things, energy. And so it plays a lot of different roles throughout the body, and is partly regulated and is partly regulatory to how the kidneys function. So I know that kind of complicates things, because the kidneys aren't exactly what you would usually think of as an endocrine gland. In some traditional medical systems, like in Chinese medicine, the kidney and the adrenal gland are kind of thought of as being different parts of one organ, which structurally is, an arbitrary but fair assessment. It is all one clump of tissue that is attached to each other, but they play different roles. And the adrenal glands aren't doing the filtration part of things, and the part of the kidney that is doing that is not doing the same endocrine system roles as what the adrenal gland is doing. But they're all affecting each other, and they're all kind of connected to each other physically. So then above that, you have the thymus gland, which produces some of the lymphocytes that are present in the body, and also has it plays a role in the development from childhood to adulthood. There's a series of changes that happens. Everybody thinks about puberty and menarche, when people are getting periods and when people are growing body hair and all this sort of thing, as being hormonal changes that happen in the transition from childhood to adulthood. But before that, there is a less obvious set of endocrine changes in which the adrenal glands start taking over for the thymus. The thymus has some regulatory functions in the body when people are smaller. Then when they get to about the age that they start losing their teeth, which is also regulated by the endocrine system. Right about when kids get to that age, their adrenal glands start functioning more like adult adrenal glands. And so they start producing cortisone, they start producing more adrenaline, they start making small amounts of testosterone and estrogen and things like that, aldosterone also. So there's some changes that are happening, you know, that are well in advance of the ones that have to do with reproduction and all that. So that's you know, something that makes a difference in how people's bodies are functioning at that stage of their life. So there's just as much difference between an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old as there is between an 8-year-old and a 12 or 14-year-old, as far as, you know, their body chemistry and things like that goes. So there's a lot of changes that happen, you know, complicated cascades or series of reactions that, you know, mostly result in people growing taller, skin changes, things like that, sweat, being more like adult sweat. You know, little kids don't really sweat that much. Their oil glands in their skin don't produce much oil and that sort of thing. And then as kids get older, they start to, and that tends to change, you know, when they're like 7 or so, it really starts to change, and then, you know, gets more dramatic later on. All right. So the thymus gland in adults is not doing all that much. It's kind of atrophied, but it is also the site of production of some immune cells, and has, you know, some is still producing some substances that are part of the regulation of metabolism. And then you have the thyroid gland, and the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. The thyroid gland is in the front, the parathyroid glands are sort of behind it and partly embedded in it. This is in front of the throat, sort of underneath the cartilage that you can feel in the front of the throat. And the thyroid gland is hugely responsible for regulating metabolism, for determining how much of the calories that you take into your body get burned as energy and how much of them get deposited as fat, and determining how energetic you feel. So with the thyroid gland, I mean, with the adrenal glands, that's something that can change quickly. You know, you might feel more energetic during one part of the day than you did during another part of the day. That's mostly the adrenal glands. Your baseline of whether you're a very energetic person or whether you tend to be more of a sedentary person is more what the thyroid has an effect on. It's far from the only thing that has an effect on that, but it does have a huge effect on that. Has a huge effect on it's when people when you see somebody who's just like naturally skinny no matter what they eat, for instance, a lot of the time that has to do with the thyroid gland. There's a pretty wide range of thyroid function that is considered normal, and then there is too low, and there's too high. And when somebody's thyroid is too low, they feel very sluggish and they tend to gain weight. And when somebody's thyroid is too high, they feel perhaps very manic, perhaps very irritable, maybe unable to sleep, maybe having heart racing and things like that. And also a lot of the time their eyes are kind of bulging. So the most common reason that I see people having thyroid issues that are out of balance is from an immune response to the thyroid, an autoimmune condition in the thyroid, which people call Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's not a very good name for it, but because sometimes there is no inflammation. And sometimes, well, It's a process that happens, and nobody's really sure why it happens. Um, but from what I've read, it seems like it was very, very uncommon in the early 1900s. I read something from that time period where someone was saying, where someone describes the situation, and usually when they saw thyroid problems, it was a goiter from somebody not having enough iodine. If somebody doesn't get any iodine in their diet, then their thyroid can become inflamed, and it can cause the same types of problems. With this situation, and that often results in a very visible bulge in someone's neck. With autoimmune thyroiditis, you usually don't see that. Sometimes you do see a visible swelling of the gland. But you get a lot of the same symptoms. Anyway, this person who was describing it a long time ago said, you'll probably never see in practice this particular situation, what we would now describe as autoimmune thyroiditis. But in my lifetime, it's very common, and it affects women about 4 out of 5. It affects about 4 women for every 1 man that it affects. So it's much more common in women than it is in men. And obviously women have different endocrine systems, but nobody is really sure what the deal is with that. Why that's like that. It's like that for autoimmune conditions in general. They tend to show up much more often in women than in men, but not exclusively by any means. And the reason why is not entirely clear, but people assume that it has something to do with the endocrine system and with the different types of steroids that are found more often in men versus found more often in women. So what happens when the thyroid becomes inflamed is that at first it becomes overactive. And so it's just like if your eyes became inflamed, your tear glands would become overactive. If you're chopping up onions and you get some inflammation in the mucosa of your eyes, and then those tear glands become overactive and weep. Thyroid does the same thing. It becomes inflamed. We're not really sure why. Maybe it's from nuclear fallout that's in the atmosphere from human activities. Maybe it's a virus. It's kind of, maybe it's none of that. But for whatever reason, the immune system starts attacking the tissue of the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland becomes inflamed and starts overproducing thyroid hormones, especially one called thyroxine and one called liothyronine, also known as T3 and T4. But when these become in the early stages of this situation, there's too much of them, and that results in the higher metabolism, more wakefulness, sometimes mania, sometimes hallucinations or delusions, sometimes outbursts of anger, things like that. And then as the condition progresses, more and more of that glandular tissue becomes scar tissue, until the point where it's no longer able to keep up, and it goes from being overactive right through being normal to being underactive, and often no longer really that functional. So at that point, person can become very sluggish and become very low energy. And if it progresses far enough, if it gets low enough, it can be life-threatening, because it can progress to the point where they no longer have the energy to perform the basic functions that keep their body alive. So that's a situation that can happen with the thyroid gland. And so those iodine-based hormones, thyroxine especially, but also liothyronine, are kind of what people think about the thyroid doing, kind of the more famous function of the thyroid. Another function that it has, which I think I mentioned last time, is that it also produces a hormone that causes the body to deposit calcium into the bones. This is called calcitonin, and it's just a short chain of amino acids that acts as a signaling molecule to the bone cells for them to absorb calcium. And the parathyroid glands produce the opposite of that, the catchily named parathyroid hormone, or parathormone, which causes the cells of the bones to release calcium into the bloodstream. And, like I was saying last time, you need a balance. You need a certain amount of calcium to be in the body at any given time in circulation. And the way that that is maintained is by banking it in the bones and spending it gradually. But if the parathyroid gland is not functioning right, you can have too much or too little of that. And also, if the thyroid gland is not functioning right, you can have too little of that particular type of hormone. So that can affect the bones, and it can affect the heart because of how it's affecting the levels of calcium in the bloodstream. And the reason calcium affects the heart is because it's responsible for conducting some of the electricity in the heart as an electrolyte. And it also helps to regulate the pH of the body, the acidity or alkalinity of the body, which has to stay within a very narrow range for people to, be alive and healthy. So then above that level, you have the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is inside the skull. It's not really part of the brain, but it's in there with it. There's a bone called the sphenoid bone, and the bottom of the sphenoid bone is sort of pointed, and it comes to a point at the roof of the mouth. So the bottom of the sphenoid bone is part of the palate in the roof of the mouth, and the top of the sphenoid bone is a cup-shaped structure called the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle, and that cup-shaped structure holds the pituitary gland. So it sits right in that little chalice, and it is kind of massaged by the movement of the sphenoid bone, and it produces a bunch of hormones that control the other endocrine glands. So, for instance, it produces thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as TSH, which is something that a lot of people get looked at on their blood work. Thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what the name says. It stimulates the thyroid. It makes the thyroid, or it messages to the thyroid to tell the thyroid to produce more thyroid hormones. If the thyroid hormones are low, the pituitary gland will produce more and more of this thyroid stimulating hormone to try and keep the thyroid doing what it needs to be doing. So in someone with a thyroid that is underactive, the thyroid stimulating hormone will often be much, much higher than it should be, or much, much higher than it would normally need to be. Similarly, there are stimulating hormones and releasing hormones produced for and by all these different organs. So there are follicle stimulating hormone, but there's also a lot of different hormones produced by the pituitary that just kind of tell these different glands to produce more of their substances, to release more of the endocrine substances that they produce, and thereby messaging other areas of the body. And the pituitary gland is it interfaces with the brain as well, with some of the involuntary functions of the brain. So those brain functions are influencing how much of the endocrine system functions are going on. So yeah, so there's a link, a direct physical link at the pituitary, and where the pituitary is in contact with the hippocampus in the brain, where there's an interface between the endocrine messaging system and the nerve messaging system. Now, I mentioned before that not all of the hormones are produced in these glands. A lot of them are produced elsewhere in the body. So, for instance, probably the most significant example of this would be that body fat produces estrogen. So, if someone has more body fat, not only does it give their body the building blocks that it needs to produce other hormones, because almost all of them, a lot of the really important ones, all the steroidal ones, are made out of cholesterol, and the cholesterol is made out of fat. But the fat itself, the fatty tissue, the adipose tissue itself, can produce estrogen, which affects metabolism and various other things in the body. So it can affect people's fertility. It can affect their mood, all sorts of things. And because people now have more body fat than people used to have on average, I mean, there's still the whole spectrum that there's ever been, of very skinny people to very fat people, but at least around here, more people, the average amount of body fat on a person is higher than what it used to be. People have more access to food, and people don't have to walk everywhere they go. We have modern conveniences and transportation and all that sort of thing. So, there's that's actually made a difference in how people's endocrine system, and by extension, how their nervous system functions, just because of the different composition of their bodies. It's also worth noting that not every body is going to respond the same way to equivalent amounts of a particular hormone. And a great example of this is insulin. Some people, especially people who have a tendency to eat a diet that contains a lot of carbohydrates, will have had more insulin, a higher amount of insulin in their system for more of their life, and therefore will develop resistance to it. So their cells are not responding to insulin in the same way that they had originally, or in the same way that they might in another person. And so that's actually what's going on in type 2 diabetes, is that it's not necessarily, at least initially, about there being a lack of this substance. It's about their body responding differently to the substance. And while that's a very dramatic example, the same is true of other substances in the body, of how someone responds to testosterone, how someone responds to estrogen, and so forth. People can have different levels of sensitivity to these different hormones. So, it's not simply a matter of, if the hormone levels are within this range, everything's fine, and if the hormone levels are out of it, then you just need to get them into that range. It's more complicated than that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, just kind of in general terms, about what we do to support people who have endocrine system issues. And that's a very broad question, but I want to talk about some of the things that are generally applicable or broadly applicable to supporting the endocrine system with herbs. And one of the things is there's a class of herbs that are sometimes called alteratives, sometimes called tonics, sometimes called adaptogens, that are sort of like tonics for this system of the body. And they work in different ways. Some of them contain substances that are sort of like a generic steroidal hormone shape that can kind of fill in for and or get in the way of some of these steroidal hormones in the body. So especially when there are issues with hormones that would be produced in the sex organs or in the adrenal glands, these types of herbs can play a role in that. So ginseng is one of them. Eleuthero is another one. Rhodiola is yet another one. Tulsi is sort of a different kind of one. It doesn't contain substances like what I just described, but it does seem to have an effect on the body's production of cortisone and how much external stress has results in a change in the endocrine system. So I use Tulsi a lot. This is a gallon jug of the tincture that I keep around. I use it in a lot of formulas for supporting the nerves and endocrine system, which often I will work on nerves and endocrine system together. But those are one category. So tonics for the endocrine system are one category of substances that we might use, and those are some examples of them. Getting enough sleep and getting adequate nutrition that includes good quality fats is a huge, not necessarily sufficient, but always necessary condition for making the endocrine system functional. You cannot have an optimally functioning endocrine system in a sleep-deprived person. You cannot have an optimally functioning endocrine system in a person whose circadian rhythms are at odds with daylight and darkness, which is the case for a lot of us really in the modern world. Like it's dark out right now. If you go camping, you probably notice that when it gets dark, you might feel like going to sleep, especially if you're not like at a festival or something where there's a lot going on, but just, somewhere where there's peace and quiet. And then when it gets dark, you might feel a strong urge to sleep. And that's a pretty natural human thing, but it's something that a lot of us don't experience very often because we have electric lights, we have exciting television shows, people to argue with on the internet, all that sort of stuff that keeps people awake. And then of course we have second and third shifts at stores and factories and so forth. And so there's a definite temptation and tendency to be out of step with daylight and darkness, and that does play a big role in regulating the endocrine system. So you can have pretty good endocrine functioning while you're working third shift, but it would be better if you weren't, and so that's something. And then of course having enough protein in your diet, having enough energy in your diet, very important for all sorts of health things, but the problems that it causes the endocrine system is one of the places that shows up if somebody is malnourished just in general. There are also a lot of substances in our environment that are endocrine disruptors. Alcohol is a significant endocrine disruptor that a lot of people self-administer. There are also things like plasticizers in plastics, which have become more of an issue that people are aware of in the last few years. BPAs have been taken out of most things, and they're one of the categories of these substances, but not the only one. There are also pesticides that are endocrine disruptors. And of course, there's external endocrine substances that people might be taking, like steroids or like birth control, like anabolic steroids or birth control, which, you know, they have their roles. I'm not saying that they're inherently things that people should never do, but they have their pros and cons. And one of their cons is that they can throw off the balance of the endocrine system, generally speaking. So keeping all of that in mind and, you know, trying to live in a way that supports your endocrine system is really important. And like I said, you know, sleeping when you're tired, being able to to rest when you're tired is a huge part of that. And, you know, humans are made in such a way that we can push through, we can push ourselves, and we have a lot of endurance, but we're really not made to push ourselves all the time. And you know, when you look at other animals our size, they tend to rest quite a bit. You know, you don't see a lion working a 40-hour work week, really. You know, they eat and they lay around. You know, and so you know, they do some hunting so that they can eat, of course, but you know, humans do have a tendency to push ourselves in society more than is strictly healthy for us, and that can be a big problem for the endocrine system. It can be a big problem for all kinds of things, but again, the endocrine system is one of the places where that shows up, especially in the form of fatigue, weight gain, and feelings of sluggishness, sometimes feelings of depression and things like that, which are complicated, but they're very strongly influenced by the endocrine system as well. And another way that we support the endocrine system is by supporting the nervous system. Like I said, they tend to work together. So, you know, supporting the nervous system and the endocrine system are, you know, there are a lot of things like the sleep thing that are extremely vital to both. But yeah, so the nervous system has a lot of control over the endocrine system and vice versa. So usually, if I'm working on one in a particular person, I'm going to be working on both of them. Any questions in general about the endocrine system before I move on to talking about a couple of different herbs for today? All right. This first herb that I want to talk about today is American ginseng, Panax quinquefolium. This is a very environmentally sensitive plant. It is also a very culturally significant plant here in Kentucky. It is traditionally something that the people gather medicinally and also for their own use, but also to sell. So it's sort of a cash crop where I come from, or you might call it a non-timber forestry product. It's something that people do grow it sometimes, like as a crop, but for the most part, it's more a matter of finding stands of it and managing those stands. Ginseng takes years to go from seed to a mature plant. So it takes about sometimes a year and a half to 2 years from the time that it's fruit on the plant, a seed, until the time that it becomes a sprouted little plant of its own. So the seed can fall off of the plant, lay on the ground, It might come up a year and a half later, in the spring, not of the year after it falls on the ground, but the following year, or it might come up the year after that. So for example, right now it's September and the ginseng has red berries on it, and inside those berries are the seeds. And if a person goes out and plants those seeds in the ground, or if they just fall on the ground, or if they get eaten by a bird and pooped out on the ground somewhere else, if the conditions are right for ginseng to grow, then not in the spring of 2024, but in the spring of 2025, those seeds might start emerging as little ginseng plants. Or they might come up in 2026, especially if it's a very cold spring in 2025. So, so not the following spring, but the spring after, or even the spring after that, is when they would start emerging as plants above ground. And then it would take, after that, sometimes another 6 years before it reaches the stage where it's a plant like what you see in this picture, where it has 3 leaves, and each of those leaves is composed of usually 5 smaller leaflets. So you can see there's the main stem, and on this one there's 3 leaflets branching off, and in older plants you'll actually get a 4th one, and that's called a 4-prong ginseng, and usually that takes sometimes 8 years, sometimes 20 years. It takes a long time. It's a long-lived plant. A ginseng plant, there are ginseng plants that have lived for over 100 years. So it's a perennial. It can grow in the same place year after year from the same root. And the roots tend to get bigger and bigger as they grow, as they get older. So it has pretty specific needs as far as where it will grow and where it will not grow. And generally, the places where it will grow look something like this. They tend to be on slopes. They tend to be in full shade, in other words, on the floor of a mature forest. The soil tends to be sandy soil, and they'll grow on the north-facing slopes, which are cooler, a little more often than they'll grow on other sides of hills. They don't exclusively grow on the north-facing slope, but if you're looking for it, that's a good place to look. But speaking of looking for it, it is a plant that that a lot of people would not want harvested off of their land, and that if you're going to harvest off public land, you have to get a permit. And some years they issue permits, and some years they don't. So it's kind of like getting a duck hunting license or something like that, but for a plant. When people harvest ginseng, usually they will go to a stand of ginseng, because you don't find this plant growing singly in the woods. Usually you find a little area where there's a bunch of it. And so people will usually harvest maybe 1 out of 10 plants or 1 out of 20 plants, a small number of the plants that are there, and then replant the seeds just by poking a hole in the ground with their finger and putting the seed down in it. And then usually, if someone does that, what they'll do is cut down the rest of the tops in that stand so that nobody else comes along. So you don't have 5 different people gathering 1/10 of the plants out of the stand, which could deplete it very quickly. If a stand of ginseng is well managed, it will last and last. It doesn't, like I said, the root itself, a single root, can live quite as long as a human lifetime, maybe much more. and they make many berries each year. So if it has the right conditions, it will continue to grow. Habitat loss because of logging and because of clearing of land to build houses and other things like that is a big threat to ginseng. In my opinion, possibly a bigger threat than people harvesting it. Because people who do harvest it, because they make money off of it, they do usually want it to keep growing. Some people don't care. But traditionally, harvesting and stewarding ginseng has been a part of Eastern Kentucky culture, and not just in Eastern Kentucky, but in the Appalachian Mountains in general. It's been a big part of the culture. It's a traditional thing. So one of the stands of ginseng that I harvest from sometimes, I've been harvesting from since I was 3 years old. I have a picture of myself with a sand shovel out there trying to find ginseng as a toddler with my parents. My dad found out about this stand of ginseng from a man named Shorty Ross, who had been harvesting for it from this stand for many years, maybe even decades before. And he just kind of got to the point where he was too old to do it anymore, to hike into the woods and get it anymore. So he was like, here's a good stand of ginseng I'll tell you about. And that was in the late 1970s. And I go back and check on it most years. I have multiple other places that I harvest from, so I don't always harvest from that stand. But in all those years, nobody's ever poached from it, or, I mean, not that it's mine in any meaningful way, in any legally binding way, I should say. But, people leave it alone. People know that I do harvest from it. And so people are just kind of like, respectful of that, and they don't mess with it. So it's just sort of an informal thing, but it is perhaps, I think that maybe that informal understanding might carry more weight in that particular community than something legally binding would. Now, when people are financially desperate, they'll do financially desperate things, of course. And so like the same type of people who go around stealing copper out of people's air conditioning units will also go and poach ginseng. And often when they do it, they'll dig up a whole stand because, they're not really concerned about long-term viability. They're concerned about what they can get today. So that is a problem. And I think what saves a lot of ginseng from that being a problem is the fact that it's a good ways from the road. It tends to it doesn't tend to be close to people's houses or in areas of the woods that people have been coming and thinning and taking trees from. It tends to be in areas that haven't been disturbed in many years, and that tends to mean further from human habitation and places where people don't usually go. So there's a question of why do you need a license to harvest it, and who would we talk to? I believe that it is they changed who does it. It's Fish and Wildlife, I believe, that issues them. Or no, it might be the National Forest Service. I believe it's the National Forest Service now, and that it used to be the other one. But you need a license to harvest it if it's on public land, a permit to harvest it if it's on public land. And this year they didn't issue them for the Daniel Boone National Forest, and I think not for some other ones as well. But if it's on private property, that's not so much the issue. If people are trying to export it out of Kentucky or export it out of the state that they're in, if they're trying to sell it in interstate commerce, that's the right word for it, then they need to be a broker. And that's a different set of certification that I don't really know that much about and haven't ever really looked into, because if I'm harvesting it, I'm just harvesting it for my own practice. I'm not, selling it commercially or anything like that. So usually the practice is that root diggers will go and get it, and they'll sell it to brokers, and then the brokers will sell it, to companies that make products out of it. Or really, most of the ginseng that is harvested from the wild in the United States ends up being used by people in China. So most of it gets exported, something like 90% of it. It is, it's pretty expensive. I've seen the prices get as high as $800 a pound. They may have gotten higher than that. Sometimes I don't always keep up with them because, like I said, I'm not really, selling it commercially. I'm just making medicine out of it, and I use that for people who come to see me, and I charge the same amount to dispense ginseng as I charge to dispense any other herb. So it's not, my business relationship with it is not what it is for other people. But if you were gathering it from public property, you would definitely, from private property, you would definitely want to make sure you had the permission of whose property it was on, and you would want to make sure you were right about whose property it was on, because sometimes people have disagreements about where the property lines are out in the woods, especially, and people have been killed for harvesting ginseng out of stands that they weren't supposed to, and things like that. So it is something that people take very seriously. Let's see. And yeah, the main reason they started doing the permits was because they had the idea that it would keep people from over harvesting it. I'm not sure that it really does, because I think that the people who are planning on over harvesting it are not necessarily going to worry so much about. They're not going to let a thing like that stop them so much. So I'm not really sure whether it has had the desired effect, or whether it's even very easy to measure whether it's had the desired effect or not, just because ginseng tends to grow where people aren't. An interesting thing about ginseng is that this species grows in eastern North America. This is Panax quinquefolium, American ginseng. There's also the Asian ginseng, which is Panax ginseng, the original plant that was called ginseng, which is just slightly different than this one. And it grows in Eastern Asia. And so those two areas are kind of similar climates in some ways, similar latitudes, similar elevations, and things like that. So it's very picky about where it grows, and those two populations probably had common ancestors millions of years ago, but have diverged a little bit from each other over the intervening millennia. Let's see, stop that share. So that is ginseng, and as far as what does it do, ginseng it's an adaptogen. It's an herb that is a tonic for the endocrine system. It tends to make people feel less inflammation, more energy, and more of a sense of general well-being. Tends to help a little bit with a whole lot of different things. It promotes circulation and moves the blood, promotes good digestion. And a lot of people who take it when they're old say that it makes them feel like they felt when they were younger, makes their body feel like they felt when they were younger. And so that's kind of what it's famous for. In the American market, I think there's a tendency to promote it as being like an aphrodisiac, or something that makes people more sexual or something like that. And I guess it does that for some people. But that's certainly not the whole story, and is not how it affects everyone. But it does tend to have some supportive effects on the endocrine system and on the body's handling of energy and metabolism. Its name, its genus name Panax comes from the word panacea, meaning remedy for everything. Sort of like a cure-all, I guess you could say. All right, let's see. And I also want to talk about another herb, which is valerian. Well, valerian has these distinctive looking compound leaves, and you can see that they're kind of on opposite sides of the stem, like one right across the stem from each other. And then it has these clusters of whitish or pinkish flowers at the top. Valerian flowers have a sort of a fruity smell to them, a sweet fruity smell to them. And the root and the leaves, if they're crushed, have some of that smell, and then also a deeper, funkier smell that a lot of people say smells like sweaty socks or feet or something like that. The substances responsible for those two different notes, those two different smells, are valeric acid, which is the more fruity one, and isovaleric acid, which is the more hoody one. And both of them are forms of pentanoic acid. So they are a 5-carbon atom organic acid. And they have an effect on the nervous system, a regulating, slowing, calming effect on the nervous system. It's basically, you could think of it as being like it turns down the voltage on the nervous system. There's a whole class of drugs called valproic acid derivatives that are based on propylvaleric acid, which is just a slight, which is another form of the same, or another variation on the same molecular structure. And those are used as mood stabilizers, and they're used as seizure drugs. Depakote is kind of probably the most famous one, or the most widely used one. There's also Depakine and some other variations, but they're either classed as anticonvulsants or mood stabilizers. But valerian is basically the same thing as what they are, or the organic acids in valerian are basically the same kind of thing as what they are. And they are, so valerian for a long time was used as, was probably the most widely used drug for controlling seizures from remote antiquity up until probably the late 1800s or early 1900s. And if it's prepared right, it's pretty good at doing that. It's just kind of, like I said, turning down the voltage on the nervous system, which means that if seizures do happen, they're not going to be as intense, and they're going to be less likely to happen. I don't necessarily recommend trying to control anyone's seizures using this, but it's definitely been done before. And in herbal medicine, mostly what we use this for is its calming properties. A lot of people who feel stressed easily, who feel like they're easily overwhelmed or something like that, valerian is helpful for that. It's also helpful for sensory integration issues. If people get overstimulated easily by loud noises and bright lights and things like that, valerian can help to keep the brain working at kind of its usual level, instead of getting so overwhelmed by sensations. Some people use valerian as a sleep aid. So it's actually a very commonly used thing that people might take to help them fall asleep. I don't love it for that. It does help people fall asleep, but a lot of the time they have really weird dreams. A lot of the time they don't necessarily feel really well rested afterwards. So I kind of think of it as being, well, there are a lot of other things that I would rather use for sleep than valerian. I definitely have used it for people, especially for people who just have a lot of trouble falling asleep in the first place. But yeah, sometimes it gives people really weird dreams or makes people feel really weird the next day if they are using valerian to sleep, especially when they first start using it. Sometimes that levels out some. It can make people feel drowsy. So, sometimes if somebody takes it, they might feel like they need to sleep. They might also have like a hard time coming up with words for things and that sort of thing. Hang on just a second. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the main part of valerian that's usually used is the root. And when the root is dug up, if it is dried quickly and not in a lot of heat, but kept in a very dry environment so that it can get fully dry, especially if it's sliced so that it can dry. It has mostly a pleasant smell to it. If it dries more slowly, it gets kind of funky smelling. Neither one of which means that it's gone bad. It's just about some of the valeric acid turning into isovaleric acid, which smells different. So a lot of people associate valerian strongly with having a really bad smell. And it's because they're used to valerian that's really not that good quality. But the smell of it is very persistent, and the substances that are in it are very stable. And one of the ways that I know this is because in about 2010 or so, I'm not sure exactly what year it was, maybe 2008, I was guest lecturing at Transylvania University, which is a small university here in Lexington, Kentucky, that was founded in the 1700s. And it was really kind of one of the first things that was here in this town way back, hundreds of years ago. And in the 1860s, when the Civil War started, it closed down for a little while. And when it reopened, they didn't restart the medical program. They had a medical school there. And so they didn't restart the medical program when they reopened in 1865 or whatever it was at the end of the Civil War. And they packaged away all their apothecary jars and put them in storage somewhere on campus. And so 140 something years later, I came along and I was guest lecturing there, and professor there, Mark Jackson, who's a medical historian, asked me if I wanted to see some of the apothecary jars from Transylvania Medical School. I was like, I didn't know you guys even had a medical school. And he's like, oh yeah, we did from, he told me what years it was from, but it ended with the Civil War. And so I found a jar of valerian and I opened it up and I smelled it, and it still had the smell of valerian to it, even though it had been sealed in a jar and just kind of forgotten about, not necessarily, stored under any sort of ideal conditions or anything, probably in an attic somewhere or something like that for a couple of human lifetimes, and it kept its scent all that time. And then I smelled it again in 2020, I think it was the last time I guest lectured there, and it still had that scent to it. Which is, I was surprised by it because it's something that don't often get the chance to interact with aromatic plants that are from that long ago. Hang on just a second. Yeah. Oh, just a second. Yeah, so here I am smelling the valerian. Valeriana is what it says on the label there, and this is the roots of some valerian that was harvested probably in the early 1860s or late, maybe 1859 or 1860. And this is in May of 2021 that this picture was taken. So, centuries, well, not centuries, but well over a century later. So, when herbs are stored just right, they can last a really, really long time. And valerian is one that probably, one of the longest lasting ones that I've gotten the chance to personally interact with in that way. There are probably others that I would expect from their chemicals makeup that would last that long if they were kept dry and everything, but I haven't personally gotten to interact with many samples of of herbs that were that old. But yeah, so valerian, even though it's aromatic, the stuff in it can persist for quite a long time. And the fact that it's aromatic and that you can smell it means that some of the molecules are coming up out of the root into the air at any given time. But if it's in a sealed container, they come up out of the air and then they go back into the root because there's nowhere else for them to end up, at least not so much. So yeah, when I'm using valerian, I use it pretty sparingly as far as in my practice. It's so I have like a 32-ounce jar I was to keep around, and I probably refill that a couple times a year. So I don't use tons of valerian compared to what I do with some other herbs. But it is something that is a well-known herb and that a lot of people use more than I do. So yeah, its main thing that people know it for is that it's calming to the nervous system. It makes people fall asleep, makes people have weird dreams. It controls tremors, shaking, restless leg, that kind of thing. Doesn't really produce a normal sleep state, but does help people to doze off. And it does help with the muscles and twitches and convulsions and things like that. It also can be used topically. And when it's used topically, it helps a lot with itching. And if I were using it for itching, I would probably use just this tincture that's right here as a spray on the skin. Some people might object to that because, like I said, it does have kind of a funky smell to it. But, sometimes if somebody's really itchy, they might not really even care about that. They might be more concerned about the relief that it would give them. So there is the possibility of using it that way. Additionally, making a salve out of it for the eyes is traditional for eye inflammation. This is something that people used in Greek and Roman times. When the Bible talks about a fly in the ointment, they were talking probably about Phrygian ointment, which was made with valerian, or perhaps some closely related plants. But it's if the eyes are burning and itching and weeping, it will actually help to soothe them. And it doesn't necessarily directly address, it's more of a symptomatic relief, but sometimes that symptomatic relief can be really helpful. And one of the eye conditions that people get a lot of the time in low resource environments, like what you probably would have had 2,000 years ago just about everywhere, is chlamydial infections in the eye. And when somebody gets an infection of chlamydia in the eye, they get rough, bumpy spots on the insides of their eyelids. And those can actually cause damage to the eye. So actually, by symptomatically treating it, you're soothing the eye, you're soothing the inflammation, but by soothing the inflammation, you're keeping scabby stuff on the inside of the eyelid from rubbing against and damaging the cornea, the optical surface of the eye. So, symptomatic relief is sometimes exactly what you need to give the body a chance to heal. Would it be good for pink eye? So it would be soothing symptomatically, but if it were like a highly allergic type of allergic conjunctivitis, I mean, not allergic, contagious conjunctivitis, infectious type of thing, it wouldn't necessarily fight the infection. There's actually something that I use for that, which is the bark of a tree called Osage orange. The root bark of Osage orange is actually really good for pink eye. And so I would probably do an eye wash with that, and then maybe put the valerian on after that as a way of soothing and relieving the symptoms, and also lubricating the eyes, which sesame oil by itself would do that, but the valerian along with it helps to make it more anti-inflammatory and more relaxing to the muscles around the eye and the tissues themselves. So it's kind of just generally soothing. So the way that kind of ointment would be made is by cooking valerian in an oil like sesame oil or olive oil at a low temperature until the stuff in the valerian is extracted out into the oil, and the oil takes on the scent of the valerian, and it'll take on some of the color too. It'll get a little bit of a darker color to it. So yeah, that's does it grow here? It does not grow wild here, but it will grow here if you grow it. So it's I've grown it in my garden, and usually what I find is that it will stick around for a couple years if I plant it, and then I'll have to plant it again. But it is not hard to grow, but it is more of a garden plant than a wild plant in this part of the world. Occasionally you might find it as an escapee from cultivation or something, but you don't tend to find it like growing as a weed or anything. So yeah, it's more of a thing that you would want to cultivate if you wanted to have it fresh. And like I said, if you're purchasing it, a lot of the time it's kind of funky, kind of maybe not been handled with exacting care, because when you're handling small batches of herbs, it's a lot easier to dry them well and quickly than it is if you're doing it on like, truckload kind of scale. A lot of the valerian that is in the United States is grown in Eastern Europe. So you can get okay quality valerian out there, but it's one that I would definitely grow myself, and that I do grow myself when I want some of it. So yeah, so there's a good nervous system herb, and also the ginseng is a good endocrine system herb. And hopefully I've given you a decent overview of what the endocrine system is and what it does, and some general strategies and ideas for how we would go about supporting it in a person who needs it. So I hope that everybody gets a chance to get out into the outside some and see how things are progressing. Right now, ragweed is in full bloom. Giant ragweed, I mean, is in full bloom, as are goldenrods. If you're driving out in the country, you might see entire fields covered in yellow, or starting to be covered in yellow, because there's a lot of goldenrod here in central Kentucky. And it blooms at the same time as ragweed, so people think that it's responsible for the allergies, but it's not. And yeah, good number of other plants starting to come into bloom right now. And in a few weeks here, we will go and look at some of them, do our fall herb walk out at Heisel Farm Park, and see some of the plants growing in that type of a setting, which is a former meadow that's kind of transitioning towards becoming a young forest. So there's a lot of different species there, many of which are the types of species that you would usually find around areas where there's been a lot of human activity. So not a lot of exotic woodland plants like the ginseng, but a lot of plants that are really good to know because they're abundant and easily found near where humans usually are. And we'll be doing that in October. So also, if you are looking around at what's going on in the natural world, walnuts are dropping right now, and hickory nuts are ripe, pecans are ripe. So lots of interesting stuff going on. Pawpaws are ripe right now, if you can find any. They're a lovely woodland fruit to get a hold of. I visited 2 stands that I usually harvest them from, and neither one had even a single fruit on it. So I think that around here it's maybe not the best year for them, although I've seen pictures from some other people who did get some. So I just haven't had any luck with them this fall. But anyway, I would strongly encourage everybody to add to your plant collections before it starts getting really cold out. And if you have any questions about that process, or would like any help with it, please let me know, and I would be happy to help. All right, any other questions for today before we go? All right, well, thank you for coming, and I will talk to you again next week. Good night.